This is some work that was done a few years ago on common ecosystem services associated with urban cycles. And what you'll see, I mean, I've picked out 3 that appear there: carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas emissions, and water quality mitigation. Most of the work that's done by those, that delivers those services is done by very, very non-iconic microbial processes. Stuff that most people would wash their hands to try and get rid of. But they're actually the things that drive these systems. We're not talking about top trophic level predators. We're not talking about these charismatics. We're talking about microbes that transform nutrients. We're talking about bacteria which can fix carbon. What's interesting though is when you look at our level of understanding of these, 3 of them, we have high levels of uncertainty. So the science is out there, but we're not very certain on how to use the science and how we can actually deal with that. So we have a huge gap. We have a gap of understanding in terms of how biodiversity drives these. But we have a level of uncertainty in the scientific literature. How then can we take this and translate this into a policy, into a decision making, into a planning forum? There really is a challenge for us. Just coming back to biodiversity and picking up on that, it does operate at 3 levels. There's the genetic, there's the flow of genetic diversity, which is really important to consider. There's the species level of diversity and also the ecosystem level. And it's worth, again, always just having these little thoughts in the back of your mind when you're considering these things. And as I said, it's often not the iconic and the common species that drive these systems. And we need to think of things across trophic levels. Now, we saw, brilliantly illustrated earlier on, the impact of the coyote in North America and how it was basically, its role, to a degree, was being replaced by a whole range of feral animals, domestic cats. But its actual functioning to the system was far more important than just its role as a top predator. And we need to think about different trophic levels, how systems work. And if you take things out, and again, it speaks to the concept of the extinction debt, we might lose certain things at certain trophic levels. But the impact of that might not be felt for generations because the system is managing to survive, but eventually gets to a point where it collapses. So we need to think across trophic levels. But we mustn't, and I always say this when I give this sort of talk, we mustn't forget about those iconic species. That panda is important today as it was then. We can't throw it away. So basically, it's not a matter of actually looking at these and saying, is it either or? Do we go for the cute and cuddly and the iconic, or do we go for the lovely bit of bacteria? We actually need both. We need the protected areas that are going to protect the iconic and the charismatic. But we really do need to rethink how we consider biodiversity in all its terms, in its genetic, its species, its ecosystems, and how it drives ecological process. So we're not saying it's a choice. You lose your protected areas, they failed, it's a false paradigm, and what we go for is a new paradigm built around protected areas around individual microbes. What we're looking at is you need to have both elements. This is just something I thought I'd play with. I thought I'd better read McInnes' publication before coming here, so I knew what he was going to be talking about. And this is a picture which you've seen earlier on. Now, I looked at this, and there's a lot of work that's been coming out recently in the literature on ecosystem services that's trying to say, can we look at the level of services over some sort of axis of degradation? So what I thought was, okay, well, let's consider this. Rather than having on this axis population probability of survival, could we have ecosystem service level, some arbitrary indicator or measure or metric for ecosystem services? And I said, well, let's go back to those 4 major categories from the MA work. Could we plot provisioning services? Oops, I'll go back. And then could we look at maybe regulating services, cultural services, and the supporting services, and actually say, do we get the same sort of thing? Do we get, maybe if we measure it today, You basically increase your density. You basically make the landscape more accessible. Maybe some of your cultural services go up because more people can get out there. Maybe the regulating services decay quite rapidly and then steady off. I don't know, this is conjecture. I'm just putting it up as a suggestion. What I am interested in is, do the supporting services which drive these other things have a gradual decline, or do they actually hit some threshold and some tipping point? Looking at how biodiversity works and looking at the curve that Joachim plotted, my guess is the supporting services would go like that. Now again, if we come back to what are the supporting services, they're the things that drive all these other services. Then maybe these curves are like that today, but with an extinction debt. They might be like that tomorrow. And that's just sort of conceptually. I've got no idea whether these curves are right or wrong. It is based on some examples in the literature, but I just thought I'd throw it up there as a thought. One of the key issues, I think, is about raising the awareness and the importance of ecosystem services. And there's a lot of good work out there. The economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, the work of the TEEB folks, is very, very interesting, very, I think, potentially very influential. And one of the things that I really like about the approach is it's hierarchical. It talks about ecosystem services in terms of recognising ecosystem services and recognising value. It also then says, for certain audiences, that might be enough just to recognise there is a value to something. Sometimes you want to actually demonstrate that value. So you might recognise the value. You might say, that wetland is good because it improves water quality. You're not actually saying how much it improves it, whether it improves it a lot or not, but you've recognised that wetland is good for improving water quality. You could say, well, actually, we've monitored it, and it improves water quality by reducing phosphates by 90%. So you've demonstrated the value, but you can capture that value. You could then say, economically, that would be the same as building a water treatment plant, which is saving every single person who pays money for water in this city $5 a year. So you've recognised the value, you've demonstrated it, and you've also then captured it. And I like that hierarchical approach because sometimes it might be enough to simply recognise. Because if you don't recognise in the first place, you can't do the other two. The other two are utterly dependent on recognising whether the service exists. And if you can go through that approach, you can assist with communicating value within urban regions and city regional planning. But if you can't recognise, they've got a problem that you're not being able to capture the value or demonstrate the value. Therefore, if you start having cost-benefit analysis and other discussions about economics, you've taken one set of values out of the decision-making process. So I think it's really important to identify, assess, recognise, and then demonstrate it. And then only then, once you've demonstrated it and you've captured it, can you actually seek solutions. And I think we need to start thinking, if you had a piece of built infrastructure, you would go through this process. You would say, this is a piece of infrastructure, it's going to do that job for me. To do that job, it needs to be doing this, this, and this, and therefore it's going to cost that. You need to think of natural ecosystems is exactly the same way as you deal with built capital assets. These are natural infrastructure that provide benefits. They yield tangible returns and they can yield cost savings. But one of the things, if you look at the literature on ecosystem services, and I had a lovely example when I was at the CBD COP in Nagoya last year, I'll say, where people fixate on value simply meaning economic monetarized value. It is X euros, X dollars per hectare per annum. And I had the chap who came to a workshop I was running at the CBD COP, who had flown over from I think it was Harare, and he had said, there's this wetland. People come there to bird watch. It's really important for the local community. They gather food from it and they fish it. People wash their clothes in it. People who come there to birdwatch stay in the local houses. I've come all the way over here because I want to find out what is the value of this wetland. I said, you just told me the value of your wetland. He said, no, I want to know the value. I said, you've just told me the value of your wetland. He said, no, but I want to know that in dollars or in whatever currency. I said, who do you need to tell that to? Why do you need to know it in dollars? Because for certain people, just knowing that that's important for bird watching and the fact it brings in revenue to the local community might be enough. And there's a lot of studies out there that come out with statements like this, and I've picked from two from my own country, from the UK, just to have a go at the UK government. That's always a good game. The benefits that inland waters bring to water quality are worth up to 1.5 billion per year to the UK. I'll say that figure's probably wrong, because it's up to 1.5, it could be 1.6, it could be 1.4. It's just a figure. The amenity benefits of living close to rivers, coasts and other woodlands is worth up to 1.3 billion. Well, these figures are useful, but they're such big figures, and can you use them in decision making? And this was summed up brilliantly by this cartoon. I didn't have any accurate numbers, so I just made this one up. Studies have shown that accurate numbers aren't more useful than ones you make up. How many studies have shown that? 87. It shows that having those figures is important, but it's not always that important. There are other things that you can use before you get to something absolute figure. This is some work I've been doing for colleagues from the UN Habitat. I've looked at a whole load of case studies from cities around the world, and I've tried to look at, in terms of pressures on cities and response options that have been put in place, and then looked at the narrative within literature which has been put out about these, and said, which ecosystem services were expected, were planned within the process, and then going back to it and analysing them and going back to a whole load of other literature and Google Earth and other maps to actually say, serendipitously, which other ecosystems also occurred. So which ones weren't recognised, which could be poor reporting, it could be conceptually they weren't recognised. And I just did it on a binary present or absent scale, so I'm not looking at quality or value, I'm just saying simply recognising them. And pretty much there's a pretty good model fit between those that were planned and those that have turned up serendipitously. So I've plotted the total number, which was serendipitous, against the total number that were planned. So there is double counting in here of some which would appear in both data sets. Interestingly, there's 4 outliers, which sat outside. And those 4 services, and I used a similar language which was in the MA, were acting as a source of pollination, storage of carbon, accumulating organic matter, which is linked in with storage of carbon, and storage recycling of nutrients. Supporting services. These weren't even recognised in a majority of the studies. This one in particular, pollination, is absolutely crucial, and it's funny, Jochen and I were discussing this earlier on. It's seen now as one of the most important, because if we don't pollinate plants, they don't grow. We can't eat food if we don't have food that's pollinated. It's absolutely crucial. We talk about climate change, we talk about carbon balances. Well, people weren't even recognising that the accumulation of organic matter, which is essentially carbon, and carbon storage wasn't happening in response options that were being put forward. And what I looked at then is I looked at this just across these 4 major classes, provisioning, supporting, cultural and regulating, and said, okay, look at this just regionally, because I had case studies from all over the world. Are there gaps in our recognition? And the white areas are the ones that were plotted on, this is plotted on a nominal 0 to 1 scale. The white areas are the services that were identified and planned, but the blue areas show that in all cases, regionally, there's the actual ecosystem services that were being delivered were far greater than those that were being considered in any reporting. Interestingly, there are some regional differences, and I think Africa is very interesting that the supporting services were hugely underrepresented. The recognition that the ecosystems were supporting biodiversity, soils, nutrient cycling. But interestingly, how all of them, the actual level of provisioning services were much lower than the other services. In terms of actually what we're physically taking from the environment, in terms of food, in terms of water, was seen as far less in terms of the services than the cultural or the regulating.